So I watched Red Dawn for the first time recently, and I'll be honest, I was a little disappointed. The film is somewhat of a cult classic, and is perhaps the single best expression of middle American patriotism you could hope to find in a film, and I really love that. I had high hopes for it on that basis, and I know this channel isn't about film critique, but
Grab him!
if you've seen the movie, then you know what I'm talking about. A lot of it's pretty cringe. I'd still recommend it though, and some spoilers if you haven't seen the movie yet and want to. That being said, the film still does a good job setting up the geopolitical and strategic situation of World War III, and really got me thinking, how close is this to the Soviet invasion plans during the Cold War? So today, we're going to be comparing the geopolitics and military strategy of Red Dawn to history. What was going on in the world at this time? What were the Soviet plans? Are there any nice details in the movie that they get right? And to find this out, remember to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more content. As always, covering topics like this doesn't really go along with a YouTube algorithm, so making sure you interact with the channel or the video in some way is greatly appreciated, and will ensure that you see when I upload it. Anyways, back to the video. Red Dawn was an American movie that came out in 1984 and stars notable actors like Charlie Sheen and Patrick Swayze. The basic plot revolves around a group of high schoolers in a Colorado town when the Soviet Union invades the United States. The group of high schoolers then retreat to the Rocky Mountains and fight a guerrilla war against the occupiers. While at times poorly acted and plagued by dated special effects, the movie really brings to life the war fantasy of so many people at a time when tension with the USSR and the threat of invasion was high. So, what exactly was happening in 1984? The early 80s was in the middle of a rise in tension in the Cold War. The 70s had been characterized by détente, a relaxing of tension between the USSR and the West that saw some denuclearization and increased diplomatic ties. Once again, the drama really starts in 1979 with the rise of tensions in Central America. In that year, three nations, Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, all shed dictatorships. Honduras's transition was peaceful, and development efforts from the UN and US helped to turn the nation into a solid Western ally, even hosting American military presence. The same could not be said, however, for the other two nations. El Salvador's military junta was overthrown by left-wing militia groups, and a brutal civil war captured the nation until 1992. America propped up the dictatorship, while the USSR supported the rebels. In the same year, Nicaragua's dictatorship was deposed by the Sandinista socialist group supported by the Soviets. The rise of another communist nation in the Western Hemisphere startled America, and 2 years later they would help fund the Contras, an anti-Sandinista group, sparking yet another long civil war in the region. Honduras avoided conflict, but served to support American allies in the area and brutally hunted communist groups in its own borders and nearby when it got the chance. Same year also saw Grenada turn communist after its own overthrow of a dictatorship, and Iran overthrew its Western-friendly monarchy, creating fear that it would become a Marxist state as well. At the end of 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan after the assassination of its communist president, and another front of proxy war opened up across the world. Soviet forces occupied the major highways and cities in Afghanistan, sparking yet another decade-long war, while the United States funded various Mujahideen Islamic freedom fighters. The role of the US and Soviet Union played in these conflicts is, of course, undisputable, although it is worth noting that these conflicts already existed and can't be blamed on them specifically, except for Afghanistan, which directly involved the Soviet invasion. The US troops did not invent rebellion in Afghanistan, just as the Soviets didn't create the Sandinistas, although both supplied their respective factions with weapons which surely extended those wars and made them more brutal. In 1982, more instability would rock Latin America, but this time the crisis was economic instead of violent. Over the previous years, Mexico had been developing its economy with the recent discovery of oil in the Gulf, and the added revenue became a staple in its production. That year, however, the price of oil dropped significantly and the Mexican economy collapsed. A similar process also took place in the Soviet Union, which was similarly dependent on oil for its economy. Of course, this was the perfect time for the USSR's longtime premier, Leonid Brezhnev, to die. Over the next 3 years, the Soviet Union would see 4 leaders, each of which would have to navigate the waters of foreign policy against the 2 most hawkish leaders of the Cold War, English Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and American President Ronald Reagan. Filling the shoes of Brezhnev was the former head of the KGB, Yuri Andropov. Andropov, while very old, was also quite paranoid of the West. Even when he was still KGB director, Andropov had initiated Operation Ryan, a campaign to search for evidence that the United States was about to attack the USSR. To top it all off, in 1983, near Moscow, an early warning came on for a Soviet missile detection center. The warning said that a missile was coming in from the US, and the crew almost launched Soviet nukes to counterattack. Fortunately, the officer in charge, Stanislav Petrov, didn't launch. Turns out the whole thing was just a glitch in the system. All of these tensions, especially on the Soviet side, culminated later that year. Every year, NATO would run a military exercise in Europe known as Able Archer. The 1983 Able Archer, however, coincided with the introduction of undefeatable Pershing II nuclear missiles to Europe. The exercises this year were also much more realistic and advanced, involving radio silence and involvement from the heads of state, which had not happened before. The Soviets, led by their paranoid premier, were on a hair trigger. Fortunately, nothing happened, in large part because a KGB agent turned MI6 mole, Oleg Koryevsky, reported this paranoia to the West and paved the way for more open communication during this time, which eased some tensions. Later in early 1984, Andropov would end up dying, and over the next year, a trio of leaders, led by Konstantin Chernenko, would control the USSR before he too would die and Gorbachev took power. So that's the world that existed when Red Dawn was filmed and released. 3 proxy wars, 2 of which were near America, economic collapse in the same region, and rising tension that almost drove the Soviets to attack. So now that we know what was actually going on, let's look at the world building we see in Red Dawn, starting on the geopolitical front. Fortunately, this part is very easy, as the film starts with text blocks literally telling us what happened in the lead up to the invasion. First, we see a motive for the Soviets, the worst wheat harvest in 55 years. This of course would push the Soviet state to the edge, in a similar but more dire reflection of the oil collapse. Next, we are informed of events in Europe. In Poland, labor and food riots led to Soviet invasion. This too is actually reminiscent of real history. The Soviet Union has had more tense relations with Poland twice during the Cold War, once in 1956 and again actually in 1980. The first time, a more liberal government that was less in line with the Soviets came to power at the same time as the Hungarian Revolution, which the Soviets actually did invade for. However, the Soviets did not end up invading Poland. The second, more relevant time coincided with the Solidarity labor movement in Poland, which tried to push for more democratic institutions and workers' rights. Here, the Soviet Union is thought to have been close to invasion, although we now know this has probably been overplayed. Nonetheless, this development was crushed by the Polish dictatorship, although it would rise again, this time successfully in 1989. Further over in West Germany, the Green Party takes power and, in an effort to ease tensions in Europe, demand NATO nuclear arsenals be removed from the continent. Once again, we see that the Red Dawn world building actually has basis in good history, which actually isn't too surprising, since the writers actually sat down with a real think tank to figure out a plausible lead-up. The Green Party in Germany had roots in student movements in the late 60s, when various countries in Western Europe began to see a rise in progressive, sometimes far-left social movements. The Green Party today is generally associated with environmentalism, but in the 80s also would have been heavily focused on denuclearization and removing American nukes from German soil. After all, if a war did break out, Germany would be the first place to get invaded and would get most of the nuking. By the early 80s, the Greens had entered the Reichstag, although they were still a smaller party. Then again, There is a history of small parties coming to power in Germany, so I suppose this is more plausible than it initially seems. The final piece of info we get is that NATO dissolves. We get no details on why this happens, although it's hinted at later in the movie.
What about Europe?
I guess they figured twice in 1 century was enough.
The near disaster that came about from Able Archer and increased presence of American nukes may also have just been too much in an alternate Europe that was more liberal. Again, it wouldn't be the first time we see a union of countries in Europe dissolve and lead to a world war. In the Americas, meanwhile, we see that Nicaragua and Cuba reached troop strength goals of 500,000 men. This, of course, assumes that the Sandinistas were able to vanquish the Contras and devote their military efforts elsewhere towards invasion. We also learn that Honduras and El Salvador fall. As we saw, Honduras was a regional ally of the US as well as the El Salvadorian government, so we can assume that the communist revolutions were successful in both countries, and to the north, Mexico is plunged into revolution, which we can assume is precipitated by the oil crisis. We can also assume that the revolution follows a similar trend as the other Latin American revolutions and sees communist revolutionaries fighting a US-backed government. Later in the movie, we get more information about the geopolitical situation. Here, we learn that 2 nations have actually taken the side of the United States. The first, which isn't surprising, is England. England's Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, was good friends with Ronald Reagan, and like him, she was very hawkish against the USSR and didn't believe in kowtowing to them at all. The UK also had a significant nuclear arsenal, and their status of being an island would also make it difficult to invade them. The other, less expected ally is China. That may seem confusing since China is and was a communist country. However, the PRC, People's Republic of China, has a complex history, and allyship could actually make some sense. Mao Zedong and the PRC rose to power in the wake of World War II, and Mao had a close friendship to Stalin and his USSR. Both regimes were big on repression in order to bring about communist utopia, which makes sense when you realize both men had the highest kill counts in history. But when Stalin died in 1953, the USSR moderated. The PSR, however, did not, and saw the new direction of the Soviets as a corruption of the Stalinist legacy. Thus, a rift emerged in the communist world. This rift didn't go unnoticed, and the USSR's greatest rival, the US, exploited this. In 1972, US President Richard Nixon visited China, and soon after, the Chinese market, along with its massive population, opened up for the West, allowing capitalism to grow while cutting the Soviets out of the world economy. As such, it isn't too much of a stretch to say that the Chinese would have taken America's side in a World War III that took place in 1984. This, of course, isn't a given, as China did fight America directly in the Korean War and by proxy in Vietnam, and we are at odds today, but both of these were before the opening of China, and obviously this was before the modern day. These allies, however, didn't fare too well. We learn that the UK, quote, won't last very long, which makes sense given their size. The Chinese have lost 400 million people in the war in less than a year, which, while being in keeping with historic Chinese trends of sacrificing millions of people to a conflict, is still a massive amount of people. Next, let's look at the Red Dawn invasion that takes place. To start, the Soviets dropped paratroopers across the passes in the Rocky Mountains in the United States. The planes were disguised as charter flights, and the control of the passes was key to controlling the most formidable geographic barrier in the United States. This is actually true to Soviet military strategy, as sending in disguised paratroopers to seize key points was done by them twice, in 1968 in Czechoslovakia and in 1979 in Afghanistan. At the same time, accurate nuclear missile strikes rained down on strategic points in the US, namely nuclear and communication centers. Omaha, Nebraska, Kansas City, missile silos in the Dakotas, and Washington are mentioned by name. Also, I assume they refer to Washington, D.C. and not the state, mainly because A, it makes more sense, and B, looking at where he points on the diagram on the fire, he is referring to the East Coast. Then the main invasion force attacked. This was facilitated by Cuban saboteurs coming into America through the southern border, and were able to disable strategic air command bases across the Midwest and Texas. The main muscle of the invasion appears to be the Nicaraguan and Cuban armies coming from the south through sympathetic/crippled Mexico and moving north through the Great Plains into the center of the country. Hemmed in by the Rockies to the west and the Mississippi River to the east, the communists move as far north as Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Kansas, before being halted by American defenses. The Russians then bolstered the Latin forces and invaded over the Bering Strait through Alaska and into Canada, cutting the oil pipeline as they went. Here as well, American forces stopped them. Within the first months of the war, the line stabilized around here. Nuclear attacks halt at this point. The USSR doesn't want to destroy America since it wants to take over and presumably siphon oil and wheat reserves, and the US has lost the capability to nuke Russia and certainly won't try to nuke itself. We have no details regarding the war in Eurasia, nor do we know if Canada has joined the war. So how does this invasion compare with the real-world plans from history? The answer is not really at all. As it turns out, the Soviet Union really had no power to actually invade the US during the Cold War. While they were certainly capable of launching nuclear strikes, it would have been virtually impossible to mount a land offensive against the US. For one, there are two massive oceans that cut the US off from the USSR. Second, the Bering Strait is in a desolate part of the world with little infrastructure and awful weather, making it difficult to move troops from mainland Russia to Alaska. Even if they did, they would have to cross Canada and the Rocky Mountains, which, as it turns out, is exactly the issue that the Russians have in Red Dawn. Invading America is extremely difficult, as it turns out, and even using Latin forces from the south is unlikely to work, given the numeric and material advantage the US has over those countries. If more of this part of the world went communist, as in Red Dawn, then it could be a bigger issue, otherwise the US wouldn't fight so hard to keep them from being communist. So I'll give the plan a tiny little bit of credit there. But in real history, there wasn't really any plans by the USSR to invade the United States. It was just too hard, and as of 2022, there isn't any public record of such a plan ever being devised. Although I wouldn't be surprised if there was some harebrained plot locked away in the depths of the Kremlin. Any attempts to topple the US, as we know from Soviet and Russian defectors, hinges on long-term social and institutional destruction rather than invading America when it's at full strength. As it turns out, no one after the early 1800s had seriously drawn up plans for invading the US. On the Wikipedia page for Red Dawn, we can see that the movie was apparently based on plans to invade the US from Germany during World War II. However, Germany didn't really plan this at all, so I don't know where this is coming from. That being said, through the 20th century there have been a couple experimental plans on how to invade the US. Maybe I'll make a video at those at some point. Let me know what you guys think. But while the Germans didn't seem to have any plan for a land invasion of the US, the concept of invading through Mexico makes sense, given that Germany allegedly tried to convince Mexico to do so during World War I. This of course never came to fruition, and probably wouldn't see a German invasion still. Instead of invading the US, the USSR had plans to invade Europe. Interestingly, both NATO and the Warsaw Pact only planned on invasion after the other side started the conflict, which is slightly reassuring that neither side was really picking a fight. What isn't reassuring, however, is the different methods of warfare that would have been employed. By the early 80s, NATO and the Warsaw Pact countries had diverged in their plans for a potential war. Despite the massive upgrade in NATO nuclear weaponry, courtesy of Ronald Reagan, the West had no intention of ever launching a first strike at the USSR and its allies. Nor did it plan on using nukes liberally, instead hoping to keep any war that broke out a conventional one and only using smaller tactical nukes as a last resort. The Soviets, however, had a very different philosophy. As stated earlier, the USSR was generally paranoid during the Cold War, a tension that only increased when Reagan and Thatcher led NATO. Rather than a gradual escalation, the Soviets planned on opening their advance with nukes. Soviet plans for European invasion changed over time, with some plans from the 60s even calling for nuking Vienna, a neutral area at the time, as well as northeastern Italy. By 1979, a military exercise known as 7 Days to the River Rhine came into practice. This plan for World War III anticipated a first nuclear strike by NATO against Poland, which would isolate East Germany from the rest of the bloc and allow the West to take it. This strike wouldn't just be one nuke, but rather dozens of smaller level strikes in major cities, especially along the Vistula River and Polish border, as well as population centers in Czechia. To start the exercise, the Eastern Bloc assumed that Soviet forces wouldn't even be able to make it to the battlefield because of the string of nuclear wasteland, and Polish forces, of course, would be destroyed. This actually didn't bother the Soviets too much, given that by this time, Poland had been a consistent troublemaker, and their support for military operations was questionable. This meant that Czechoslovakian, Hungarian, and East German forces would be the only conventional forces quickly available. The counterattack would begin with massive nuclear bombing campaigns across Germany and the Low Countries, especially targeting ports and population centers along the Rhine River. Virtually every major German city would be nuked. Denmark would also likely have been nuked, although the 1979 Polish map that I was working off of didn't show this. Warsaw Pact ground forces, at the time numerically superior to NATO, would push west through the hellscape and hopefully reach the Rhine within a week, taking Germany. More tactical and nuclear strikes would presumably be used by both sides as the Soviets advanced. The Warsaw Pact countries didn't aim to attack England or France, largely in an attempt to prevent further escalation. With Central Europe already destroyed and no further threat being posed, it is possible that these countries would call it quits and cut their losses, rather than instigate another wave of nuclear war. Both countries, after all, had their own nuclear arsenals. Conventional attacks would still take place, however, especially against England. The US didn't really figure into this plan at all, and Soviets hoped to take a decisive quick victory within a week and offer the West a way out so as to prevent even more escalation. Had this plan ever come to fruition, we can estimate that between 80 and 100 million people would die in this first week alone. Radiation poisoning would likely kill millions more in the coming weeks, and even more in a long-term capacity. On a slightly less depressing note, we do have one other interesting map to look at. This map doesn't come from any military archive, nor is it even from the USSR, but rather Yugoslavia. This map is from an atlas at some point in the 1980s and shows what seems to be a strategic breakdown of the US. Rather than invasion plans, it shows a variety of exploitable weaknesses, economic, social, and geographic. Sadly, some of the key isn't available to us, but we can try to figure out what we can from the map. Blue arrows on the oceans show key shipping routes, and disruptor lines demarcate key straits. On land, key areas of the US are shaded, namely the West Coast for its cultural center, the East Coast for its population center, the Gulf region for its oil and fuel, and the Midwest for its industry. Early warning systems and radar installations are marked, mostly appearing along the Arctic Circle, Florida, and the Dakotas. The Soviet allies of Cuba and Nicaragua are shaded as well. But from there, the map starts to point to a more hostile direction, and in some instances shows the ignorance of American norms and geography, a theme that we'll touch on in a minute. Los Angeles, for example, is shown in the wrong place, and disputed borders between the US and Canada are marked as well, indicating the Yugoslavs saw these as potential sources of conflict. In actuality, of course, this was not the case. If you live in Canada or the US, you probably didn't even know that there were disputed borders, because it's not a big deal. ICBM routes are shown as well, although once again the lines don't really make sense. They seem to go both ways and emanate and lead to some random points, including central Ottawa and Tennessee. Separatist regions are also shown, namely Quebec in Canada, Nation of Islam Black Muslims in Chicago, and Mexican Americans in Texas. Vectors of attack appear as well, with indicators that Mexico could invade the US to help their respective diaspora, and America could invade Canada either in the event of war with the Soviets or the disputed borders issue. Of course, All of these points don't really make any sense either, save for Quebec. To top off the map, we see a communist troop presence in Cuba, Soviet nuclear subs in the 3 oceans around the Americas, and potential avenues of attack against the US. This map, while very interesting, is also quite confusing, partly because much of the legend isn't explained, and partly because the Yugoslavs seem to have no idea what's going on with America. The miscommunication and paranoia that almost brought the world to war in the 1980s was born out of a fundamental ignorance of how the other group worked. The Soviets, for example, did not understand that the West was morally against a nuclear surprise attack on them. Understanding this, of course, would have massively tamped down Soviet paranoia. Looking at this map specifically, we see that Yugoslavic projections may have played a role in interpreting the vulnerability of the US. Despite having some disputed borders, the US and Canada had very little tension, and invasion was never a concern for anyone. The separatist groups in the US also weren't too big a deal, with the Nation of Islam not being powerful or large, and the Mexican Americans actually liking America for the most part. The whole concept of exploiting US weaknesses doesn't make sense here, since they don't even understand what a weakness is and isn't. That being said, it's a pretty cool map. This actually shows up in Red Dawn a little bit in the scene where the Soviets come into the mountains and look at the commemorative sign. While obviously the guy reading the sign is kind of making it up, it's still obvious that he looks at the world through a Soviet lens and lives off of the idea of revolutions and class revolutions, and that the US is an inherently evil place. So in short, how realistic is the invasion of Red Dawn? Well, the writers did a very good job setting up a realistic geopolitical scenario. The Soviets are given a motive with their poor harvest, and the dynamics of Poland and Germany reflect political tensions that really did exist during this time. The Central American tensions are done well as well, and also play off of real political concerns at the time, with successful communist revolutions in existing war zones and real economic collapse leading to the ideology's spread. Even the invasion plan itself makes some sense. However, the Soviets never had any plans to invade the US. America is too isolated, too big, and too powerful to be invaded. The Soviets understood that. The social reality explored in Red Dawn also makes sense as well, with the Soviets having a very certain point of view and not really understanding American ideas or dynamics, as shown by reading the sign, or when one of the commanders thinks that the Boy Scouts is a paramilitary force. Red Dawn is of course an exercise in alternate historical revision for the sake of a movie, similar to Man in the High Castle, which isn't bad at all. Was the Soviet Union ever invading the US likely or even possible? No, not really. But the world building is done in such a way where it is respectful of real historical happenings and is perhaps as realistic as one could make the scenario when reverse engineering it. So that's it for this video, everyone. Hope you enjoyed. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. I had a lot of fun making this one. And hit the notification bell, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.